Welcome to the Predictable Revenue Podcast, where sales leaders teach you what's working for them and how you can build it yourself.
This episode of the Predictable Revenue Podcast is brought to you by our sales coaching and consulting services. Are you looking to create repeatable, scalable, and predictable revenue? We've helped thousands of companies grow their business with tailored expert advice backed by testing to ensure they establish the best practices that'll work for them. Head over to bit.ly/predictable revenue coaching to learn more. We know that in the modern revenue organization, there's more data than ever. We know in any organization that there is more data than ever these days. And it can be quite a feat trying to gather that all up, put it to use it to kind of guide your strategy, guide anything that you're doing. And when we kind of think about how we should start basically giving ourselves the opportunity to gather data, I think a lot of us think about automation, like just throw some automation on it, that it will enable us to track the metrics. We get the data, we get the insights, we make brilliant decisions, bottom line increases by however much. But that is just simply not the case. It is much more complex than that. So that's what we're going to talk about today. I'm your host, Sarah Hicks, and today on the old Predictable Revenue Podcast, I'm going to be chatting with an expert about why data hygiene in your sales org is more important but less complex than you think. As the co-founder and former CEO of Persist IQ, Cycle.io, and now Scratchpad, which recently raised $33 million in Series B funding. Congrats. He has dedicated the last decade to improving and automating RevOps, particularly the sales process for B2B enterprise sales reps and teams. Over this time, he's become fully entrenched in trying to solve the issues and challenges that enterprise sales reps and RevOps teams face today. Pouyan Salehi, welcome to the Predictable Revenue Podcast.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it.
So tell me, just to kind of set the scene here, obviously you've got a ton of expertise in the world of RevOps, and that really ties into what we're going to be talking about today. Tell me what the goal of RevOps is, just to set the stage.
Ooh, starting off with a controversial question already. I'll be honest, I'm still learning a little bit about it as well. I feel like it's a relatively newer function that's been coming up. Mm-hmm. Marketing ops, sales ops, CS ops, now RevOps. I mean, in a way, I think it's trying to unify all of those functions under one and look at it more from a business perspective. Say, as a business, how do we create delightful experiences for our customers? How do we generate revenue? And how do workflows, automations, data capture, data usage work well across all of these all of these functions first? That's my working understanding of it.
Cool. Absolutely. And now tell me about the role that data hygiene plays, particularly in the sales world.
I mean, you nailed it up front, I think, by saying that data, it's like all becoming about data now. And the role that it plays, I mean, it helps inform decisions, which is a really important part. A lot more organizations, I think, are becoming data-driven. Sales organizations trying to make smarter decisions off of that, trying to predict their forecasts, also individual team member performance. So I think the data itself has a lot of uses for it. Now, how it's actually done in practice, I think, is very different, because most folks get stuck at, we just need the data. And that seems to be where most of the effort goes, not into how do we actually consume the data that we have? Why do we need this data? What are we going to do with this data? So that's a trend that I've been seeing.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, that totally makes sense. So let's think from kind of the beginning, from building from scratch. If you're thinking about the ways that you can start to gather this data, however that may be, where do you start? And kind of how do you think about that before taking those steps to create and gather all the data?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think it's one that transcends just RevOps or sales ops. I was actually talking to an engineer earlier today who was talking about the organization and saying, we have too much data. Like, we have over-engineered things. We are tracking way too much, because the architecture is beautiful. All the stuff is there, but in a way it's forced that organization to become so data-driven that they've almost lost their ability to make informed decisions. And in business, sometimes it's not just about the data. The data can inform a decision, but it may be about intuition. It may be about other factors that come into making that decision. So too much data can actually be a problem. I think starting up front, what I would do, and this is what we've done at Scratchpad, is just ask the question of what's like the bare minimum that we need and why. So I always like to ask the question, why do we need this data? How are we actually going to use this data? What decisions is it going to inform? And work backwards from the decision points and see, okay, you know what, like this data may be interesting to track, but at the end of the day, it's not going to really inform our decision one way or another. So maybe we can pass on this. And that going through that exercise, going through a few iterations of it helps narrow the focus and say, okay, for these types of decisions or to get this understanding of our business, this is really the core stuff that we need.
Okay, interesting. So what are some of those common decision points that you see in the sales org that you think are the important places to track that data?
Common places I see. Sorry, say that one more time. I want to make sure I got that.
When we're thinking from that sales perspective, what do you think are the best decision points to be starting to collect that sort of data?
Oh gosh, that really depends on where you're at in your business, right? If you're in scaling mode, then it could be, how many sales reps do we need to hire? Okay, well then the data you want to look at is a lot different than, let's say, if you're just trying to figure out your go-to-market motion in the first place, or what are the types of customers that you have. So it's hard to say, listen, in sales in general, but I would say in any type of revenue organization that you're in, understand like what is the key decision or what's the key question that you're asking and why, and how does that connect to the other things? And then just work backwards and try to keep it simple, like ideally to one metric, maybe no more than 3. And I think that level of simplicity can help a lot to say, okay, this is just what we need to track, and know that you could always track more if you wanted to. But I think the natural tendency is, listen, we may not know what we actually want, so let's track everything.
Yeah.
And then what happens is you have all the data and then you get lost in the analysis part and you never actually connect it to a critical question that you're trying to ask.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't know if I answered your question, but that's
no. Totally. Yeah, absolutely. It all comes down to the organization, the stage of the company, and it's not about it being a common set of metrics that you want to track. It's about what metrics do you need to track based on the questions that you're trying to answer. Yeah, absolutely. Makes sense. And when we're thinking about then implementing some sort of system or some sort of tracking, what kind of, I guess, impact does that have then on the organization that's trying to do their job? Like, are we trying to avoid things where we're asking people to shift the way that they currently do things? Is it sort of recommend, like, is it okay or condoned if it's for the sake of collecting data? What's the move there?
I think that's the heart of the issue right there. And when you talk about the data that you want in sales, so the sales team has their job to do. But it's not just the sales leadership that's asking for the data. A lot of times product will come in and say, all right, we want to know what's standing out about the product in these deals, or what features are actually leading to deals getting done versus deals lost, right? So then they'll submit a request and say, we want to capture this data in the sales process. Marketing comes in. We want to know these few things. Finance comes in. All these other folks come in. And so before you know it, you have this long list of things that as a sales rep, you need to gather that has nothing to do with you actually closing the deal or hitting your own success metrics. So I think that's one point that I'm seeing more and more. And I think it's supporting your point earlier around organizations just becoming more data driven. So anyway, so let's look at it through this lens of lots of data requests being made of the sales organization, right? Those usually get funneled through the ops organization. Well, what are the tools that ops has? You usually have page layouts in Salesforce, you've got validation rules, you have required fields. And so the levers that most ops folks are pulling is, how do I make this required? Right? How can I build structure both into the data and then have these key checkpoints so that a rep can't move forward until they fill this data? Why? Because leadership is saying they need this data, so I should do it. Is it a wrong thing to do? No, I mean, that's probably, if that's all you knew to do, then that's probably what you do. But what I think it misses is the opportunity to actually capture this data by influencing workflow instead of the data structure and making it required. So what it's doing is it's putting all of the burden on top of the rep. I've got my quota to hit. I've got my pipeline to manage. I've got, my manager to deal with, which is a whole nother topic, but I've got all this stuff to do. And on top of that, I have this really rigid, structured process that ops has put in place for me. And that is present in most sales organizations that I've talked to. And the impact of that is devastating, right? It's hurting the reps, it's hurting their morale, it's hurting their productivity, and it's still not getting the data that they want, right? Because what do you do as a rep? all right, right before, like right at that last minute, I'm just going to put some stuff in there. So you're not actually getting an accurate reflection of what's going on. So it's really not serving anybody well. The view that we take here at Scratchpad on how to influence that is through simplicity. Is imagine a world where you could get rid of validation rules, required fields, and these like ridiculous page layouts, but most reps are actually capturing this data today. It's just not getting into the CRM. And so we looked at it through that perspective and said, well, what if you could just make it simple? What if you could just make it easy? What if you can make it fast? And that's one thing that we're seeing some RevOps teams lean into now, is saying there is another tool that we have. There's another lever that we have that we could pull to still get the same objective, but it's aligning with how the reps already work, instead of saying, nope, you've got a block here, you've got a hurdle here, you've got to, figure out this crazy combination code before you can proceed to the next stage in your deal. And I think that's something we'll probably start seeing more of in sales organizations, of folks adopting that mindset that there's so much you can achieve just by making things simple.
Yeah. Give me an example of what that might look like then in your CRM.
Yeah.
Like, where are you putting those little points for data to be captured?
So let's pick something that I think most orgs are doing today, right? Implementing a sales methodology. Some organizations are like cycling through them faster than the first one even got adopted, but whatever, that's a whole nother point. Let's say you just rolled out MedPick. Well, most implementations look like in Salesforce, in the page layout of the opportunity, you're putting either a MedPick section or you're just having those fields. And if you're getting really advanced, you're actually putting validation rules to say, okay, if you don't have the M and the E and the D filled out, you can't proceed to stage 3. So you got to fill that out and so forth. But let's not even go there yet. So that's the traditional implementation. Well, I, as a rep, I'm not going into Salesforce after every call to fill that stuff out, right? I've got my notebook here, I've got my notes somewhere else, and I'm tracking stuff somewhere else. And then right before, whenever is required, I'm going to go in and just put the bare minimum. Mm-hmm. What we did is say, okay, well, how are reps working today? And so at Scratchpad, we built what we call the workspace for them. So it's got the same core primitives, like a spreadsheet type view, and a note application, a task manager, and a bunch of other stuff. So we just take that field from Salesforce, but let you bring it anywhere you are, right? So let's say I just got off the call. I'm in Google Calendar. I'm trying to I already scheduled my check-in. So I've closed the loop on that. Right from there, I can pull up the field related to that opportunity and just pull in the metric that they care about, or who the decision maker is. And so it's that level of, it sounds so simple when I say it, but that little bit makes all the difference in the world, because my mind is moving a lot faster as a sales rep than I think I can actually navigate Salesforce or the tools with. So if you can make the tool work as fast as you do, you're actually getting the stuff in there.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, cool. So just giving them the opportunity to fill it in when it comes to mind, as opposed to forcing them through a new, longer workflow.
Exactly.
That's totally disruptive.
And wherever you are, right? Like it could be in Google Calendar, I could be in email, I could be on LinkedIn, I could, wherever I am, but the ability for this system to work for me when it comes to my mind and say, oh yeah, I just got off that call, I triggered a thought there and I want to access that information and update it. I should be able to do so without having to open multiple tabs, wait 2 minutes for the pages to load, scroll down through hundreds of fields to find the right one.
Absolutely. Okay. So let's imagine that we're an organization who's, asked those questions. They know the simple few metrics that they want to be tracking. They've set it up and they are capturing that stuff accurately. What is the first step for actually analyzing that data and then putting it to use, back into the system?
There's a whole nother excellent question right there. And what I actually like to do as an exercise is assume, right? Anytime I'm thinking about capturing this data, or a team says, all right, we need to do this, just assume for a second you have the data and it's perfect and it's exactly where you need it to be in Salesforce. Then what? Who's using it, right? When? How often, right? Yeah. Exactly. How are you? It's funny how few people actually do that, because they're so focused on actually capturing the data. But I think, again, at least for me, the way my mind works is if you work backwards from that point of, okay, I assume I have it, what am I actually doing with it? That, I think, answers your question right there, because maybe this data only needs to really be looked at once a month, just to make sure that you are staying on track and not deviating too much. Other data, you may want to be looking at every single day to make sure that you are staying on track, on top of the deals, you don't have anything that's slipping. So in a way, it's working backwards from the usage of the data. like the usage profile of that data to come up with the way that you're going to access it. But the key point that I want to make here is, as you're thinking about your data structure, as you're thinking about your data strategy, not having data capture be the sole thing, which I think in most places are, it's data usage as well. And like bring these two together at the same time and say, how are we capturing, but just as equally important, how are we using this data? Who's using it? How are they getting it? Or how many people are looking at this data together? And are there points where the accessibility may unlock new things that we never even thought of before?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Interesting. So who ideally, I'm sure RevOps is the kind of overarching owner of making sure the systems are in place and sort of, I guess, sharing the data with whoever needs to see it. But in a maybe an earlier stage org before they build out that function of the company, who owns this? Whose job is this? Who?
That's a good question. When it depends on how early you want to go. Sometimes it's one of the founders. Sometimes it's an engineer. Sometimes it's the sales leader that's also the RevOps leader as well and doing everything. But even in a large organization, when you have RevOps, what I've seen is a lot of times it's the managers that own it, because they're like, listen, our RevOps team is so busy with other initiatives that they're never going to catch up to what I need right now. So I'm actually just going to create a spreadsheet, and I'm going to share this spreadsheet with my reps, tell them to fill that piece out, and then we're working out of a spreadsheet together. Right. So in that world, the sales manager or the division leader or the sales leader, in a way, is doing part of the job of RevOps. It's just outside of the existing tooling and systems that the organization's using. So the job to be done, you can actually detach from the role itself. Ideally, you have a RevOps team that isn't so overloaded with initiatives that they're able to respond quickly, both to needs of the business, of like individuals on the team, but also the business as a whole. And I think that's a challenge that RevOps faces, right? Because they're getting requests from leadership, but they're also getting requests bottom up, and you're kind of stuck like, well, who do I listen to? What do I do? I can't do all of this at the same time.
Yeah.
I've yet to meet a RevOps team that is like, we feel like we're being proactive. We feel like we're able to listen. Almost all of them are like, we are so buried, we don't even have time for new initiatives.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that's a perfect segue to kind of talking about, you mentioned obviously different stage company requires different types of data. There's different decisions being made, different levels of complexity. If we're thinking about following the growth of a company and thinking about what we need to gather in the short term versus what we need to kind of gather on long-term big picture stuff, and then how we bring that together, what do you think, I guess the strategy is for that?
So if you're just starting out, and again, I'll make a few assumptions here, right? Generally, you're trying to figure out who your ICP is, where you're winning, what's leading to your success or not, like why you're failing. And so I think working backwards again from that, like those core questions that you'd want to be answering, and say, what's the key information that we need to capture here? Knowing that we can't capture it all. Otherwise, what you're asking your reps to do is basically be live survey takers and like fill all that stuff out. Like we still need to close deals. So, I can't answer that for every business out there, but you'll want to try to understand, okay, why is it that we won? What are the core things that led to this? What are the use cases, the outcomes that the buyer, whatever solution we're selling, is really drawn to, and how are we influencing those things? What do we have to overcome? The same thing you could have on your closed loss. Like if you're not losing deals, you're probably not doing a good enough job. Like you should be losing some deals, but what can you learn from those, right? And then making sure that what goes in there is not just some BS so that the rep could get the deal closed, but it's easy enough for them to say, I put a few minutes of thought into here of like why we actually lost this thing. So that's what I would start with. And then I think that would influence a lot of the decisions I would make as a leader on, okay, where are we having success? Where are we not? How can we adjust these things, and how can we keep improving it? And then over time, you can keep adding to that. But that's where I would start.
Makes sense. What is one of the, I guess, most common things that you think companies are not tracking that they should be these days?
That's a great question. That they're not tracking that they should be. I think getting an accurate reflection of what's actually happening is what they're not getting. And I'll give you an example. We started working with one company recently, and after they had implemented Scratchpad, they're like, our close rate went down. And you'd be like, well, that's, at first I heard that. I was like, oh shit, what did we do?
Oh, how on earth did we do that? Yeah.
I know. Usually you're supposed to influence it the opposite way, but they were ecstatic about this, which caught me off guard. They're like, no, listen, we always knew the close rate that was showing in Salesforce was just off. So we could never trust it. But the fact that it went down was an indication to us that the data that we're tracking is actually accurate now, right? We can start relying on this data a little bit more. So the reason I think I struggled answering that question up front, I was like, oh, that's a good question. Listen, adding the field to Salesforce is trivial. Most organizations have it. So I don't think that there's like some magical new field to add that, you should really be tracking that one. I think taking stock of what you actually have, cutting stuff down and just saying, what's the what is the core that we really need? And then making sure that that is being updated on a regular basis, not just, hey, somehow magically before the deal moved to closed won, it went from like 0% data coverage to like 90% data coverage. Yeah. I would just focus on that, the basics, but doing the basics really well.
Yeah, it's interesting. It kind of brings to mind an example for me, just even in the specific little chunk of revenue sales, like the sales development, the prospecting piece, and what you've explained of kind of working backwards from the important things and then asking the questions of how do you get there? I think it's such a common thing that people miss. Like we track anything that the sales engagement tool can give us, like so many metrics. And then it's like, okay, and what do we do with each of these things? But it sometimes doesn't tell the whole story. Like we know data is bad at telling stories. There are people who have a whole expertise and many years of education in literally interpreting data because it's hard to do. But even in something as simple as the prospecting pipeline, we look at, I enrolled this many people, but only this many people converted to a demo. And there's so many steps in between that could influence that thing. And this was happening with one of the clients that I'm working with. And it was like, man, that's actually not a good conversion rate. It's really not good. We don't know what to do. And then looking at the number, turns out in terms of when they're making phone calls, the people they connect with is a really low volume. So in reality, of the people they connect with, they convert a ton of them. They just don't connect to the right people. And that would obviously inform a whole different business strategy. If it's like, oh man, bad conversion, train the reps, make them read ebooks, make them do call reviews every single day. None of that would influence that demo conversion rate, but getting better data, making, a little more dials to like pad that up, whatever that might be. It's a whole different story. So it's interesting to think of like working backwards from that goal then looking at all of the stages that influence it and seeing what's actually going on.
One other area that, we started doing had a huge impact on our own business, but we're seeing a lot of customers that we're working with do this as well, is the transition points and handoffs. And so what do I mean by that, right? Let's say, we're so focused on capturing data at top of the funnel and closing deals. Well, what happens after that, right? And especially in a SaaS business, it's all about expansion. It's all about renewals. And what we're seeing is, again, put myself back in the shoes of the account executive. Not only do I have to manage a pipeline and close the deals, but on top of that, I've got all of this other crap that I need to fill out for product and marketing and finance and legal and all this stuff that forget about like trying to fill out whatever form or something else that needs to be handed off to the CS manager or the account manager. But what we're starting to see, again, when you reduce the complexity and make it fast and simple, being able to track the outcomes. Why did somebody purchase your solution? What were they hoping to influence in their own business? And who are the key people that are there? When you're capturing, you should have that as an AE anyway, right? You need that to be able to close the deal. But then capturing that, and then back to what I was saying before about data usage, knowing that your account manager, your CSM, and possibly the leadership team is going to rely on that. So how can they easily access that info? Because usually it's stuck in your Google Docs or Apple Notes or Evernote somewhere, right? But by making that easy to capture, accessible in Salesforce, and then easy to access that through a system like Scratchpad, what we've seen is it just creates more delightful customer experiences. So let's say, Sarah, if you're the client, I'm the CSM, I get on a call with you, I don't have to do discovery again. I'm not asking you, oh, great, you bought our solution. Like, what are you hoping to get out of this? What I can do instead is say, hey, thanks so much for becoming a customer. Here's what I know so far. I've learned that you care about these things. This is what you're hoping to get out of the first quarter and working with us. Is that correct? Is there anything else you want to add to it? And that can make all the difference in the world in how you start off the relationship, the value that you start seeing. And that's one piece of that, you asked like what data are folks probably not capturing that they should? It's hard to say. I mean, it's being captured, it's just not being used.
Yeah. Yeah, you're totally right. And I think there's been a lot more attention when we're thinking about a handover. There's a lot of attention these days on the SDR AE handover. Like we're becoming more aware maybe of that little bit of the customer journey being a little bit frictionful. But I absolutely always still see it's like, hey guys, there's one more. There's one more that's actually super important over there. Because of course we have so much data from different sources about the time to value and how much that impacts lifetime value. And like you're saying, that the delightful customer experience comes from that quick, I'm ready to help. I know what you care about. Let's get started, as opposed to a yet another discovery call, like you mentioned. And it obviously ties back to what you shared at the beginning, kind of the goal of RevOps being to unite all of these different departments or arms of the greater revenue generating organization in collecting the data once where it's useful and then sharing it where it's useful. You're doing that in a really, really simple way, as opposed to it being this like complex Rain Man-esque thing where you're like, here's that pulling data from here and here and here, and I'm throwing it here. And it's like, it is much more simple. And as what we said in the title of the show, it's super important and it's way, way less complicated than you think it is.
Yeah. And I think it requires a slightly different skill set as well of the RevOps team, which is that of a UX designer. And that's not something that you often see in a RevOps org, right? You think about data and you think about systems and you think about all of that. But back to what I was saying before, which is it's not just about data capture, but also having a very clear idea of how that data is actually going to be leveraged, how it's going to be used, who's accessing it, how, when, for what purpose, how does that fit into their workflow? And when you keep that in mind as you're designing the system, you're just going to get more adoption out of it. And that's, again, it's more of a design mindset, like a UX design mindset, than it is any sort of like data and analysis or systems.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, I think that's a perfect place to wrap it up. We could go on and on, but this is, super interesting. Great to have a kind of clear picture of how to simplify things, the types of things you should be looking for when you're looking to implement these types of systems, and how it is, like we said, just much less complicated than we think it would be. If people want to get in touch with you, Pouyan, if they want to get reach out to you, how can they do that?
I'm on LinkedIn, find me there, or just go to scratchpad.com, or it's just my first name, last name at scratchpad.com. So you can send me a note.
Awesome. Well, it was an absolute pleasure having you on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Great having you. And thank you to all of you guys for joining us on another episode of the Predictable Revenue Podcast. Please, if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button on YouTube so that you can be notified each week when we have wonderful guests joining us and telling us all the ins and outs of how to do our jobs better in sales and revenue and all of that. So we'll catch you next time. Thank you.